The sun had just begun to set as Flight 782, a mid-range commercial airliner, prepared for its journey across the Pacific Ocean. Departing from Jakarta, Indonesia, the aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, was bound for Sydney, Australia, with 162 passengers and 8 crew members on board. The airline, known for its reliable service, had completed this route hundreds of times before without issue. But this flight would be different. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Monroe and First Officer Richard Hale ran through their final pre-flight checks. The aircraft had passed all maintenance inspections, and the weather forecast predicted calm skies for most of the journey. There was no reason to expect trouble. Jakarta Tower, Flight 782 ready for takeoff, Monroe radioed. The response was swift. Cleared for takeoff, 782, safe journey. The engines roared to life as the aircraft sped down the runway and lifted into the sky. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, adjusting their headrests and plugging in their headphones for the long flight ahead. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, offering drinks and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. Everything about the departure was textbook perfect. But as Flight 782 climbed to 35,000 feet, a mysterious signal began emanating from the aircraft, an anomaly that would lead to one of the most perplexing aviation mysteries ever recorded. Roughly 2 hours into the flight, as the aircraft cruised over the vast, empty expanse of the Indian Ocean, an unexpected transmission disruption occurred. The aircraft's transponder, which constantly relayed its position to air traffic control, suddenly went offline. Ground radar stations in Jakarta and Darwin lost track of Flight 782 almost simultaneously. Within moments, the aircraft had disappeared from all flight tracking systems. It was as if Flight 782 had vanished into thin air. Inside the cockpit, Captain Monroe and First Officer Hale had no idea their aircraft had just disappeared from radar. To them, everything appeared normal, until they noticed something strange. "We just lost our ADS-B signal," Monroe said, checking his instrument. "Banal. That's odd," Hale replied, flipping through the manual for troubleshooting procedures. "Try contacting Jakarta." Monroe pressed the radio button. "Jakarta Control, this is Flight 782. Do you copy?" No response. "Jakarta Control, Flight 782, requesting confirmation of signal." Silence. Monroe glanced at his co-pilot. "Try Darwin Control." Hale adjusted the frequency and tried again. Still nothing. The realization dawned. They were completely cut off. As the flight crew struggled to re-establish communication, systems inside the aircraft began failing one by one. First, the navigation display flickered, then went dark. The backup radio system failed. Even the GPS, which was supposed to operate independently of other avionics, started giving erratic readings. The cockpit became filled with warning alerts flashing across their screens. "What the hell is happening?" Monroe muttered, as he manually adjusted the aircraft's heading. The plane was now flying blind. No GPS, no radar contact, and no way to communicate with air traffic control. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers were unaware of the growing crisis. In the cockpit, flight attendants moved about normally, checking on passengers. But a few frequent flyers noticed something strange. One man seated near the wing window noticed that the ocean below seemed much closer than it should be. Had they descended? Was the flight off course? He turned to his wife. "Do you feel like we're lower than we should be?" he asked. She glanced out the window and frowned. "I don't know, but it does look like we're not as high as before." Back in the cockpit, Monroe and Hale had bigger concerns. The altimeter readings were inconsistent. One moment it displayed 35,000 feet, the next 27,000 feet. Then suddenly, it flashed 19,000 feet before jumping back up. Were they losing altitude? Or was it just another system failure? Then, the worst possible scenario unfolded. Without warning, the aircraft violently pitched downward. The nose of the plane dropped at a dangerous angle, and within seconds, the airliner was in a rapid descent. "Pull up! Pull up!" Hale shouted as Monroe struggled against the controls. The Control column was stiff, unresponsive. The ground proximity warning system, GPWS, blared in the cockpit. Terrain, terrain, pull up! Passengers screamed as their bodies were lifted out of their seats due to the sudden drop. Objects flew through the cabin, hitting people as the aircraft plunged through thousands of feet in mere seconds. Flight attendants clung to anything they could, some hitting the ceiling before slamming back down into their seats. A young boy gripped his mother's hand, tears streaming down his face as the cabin shook violently. Monroe and Hale fought desperately to regain control. Monroe pressed every emergency button he could think of. Come on, he yelled, forcing the yoke forward with all his strength. At 12,000 feet, the plane suddenly leveled out. The terrifying descent stopped, but the aircraft was still heavily damaged. Something had taken control, and just as quickly as it had lost altitude, it now stabilized. What the hell just happened? Hale gasped. The ocean stretched endlessly below them, an eerie reminder of how close they had come to crashing. Then, the engines cut out completely. For a moment, silence filled the aircraft. Only the soft whirring of wind resistance could be heard as Flight 782 glided over the open sea. We're losing power, Hale shouted. Damn it, we're going in, Monroe yelled back. The crew scrambled for a water landing checklist, knowing their chances of survival depended on executing the ditching perfectly. Monroe pulled the nose up slightly to flare the aircraft, reducing impact speed. Brace for impact, the lead flight attendant shouted, repeating the command over and over. The Boeing 737 hit the ocean surface with a tremendous force, sending a wall of water over the fuselage. The impact was brutal, but somehow the aircraft remained mostly intact. Passengers coughed, gasping for air as the cabin rapidly began taking on water. Flight attendants rushed to open the emergency exits as inflatable life rafts deployed. The aircraft was sinking. Monroe and Hale grabbed the emergency radio beacon, activating it in hopes of alerting search and rescue teams. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 782. We've ditched in the Indian Ocean. We need immediate assistance. As the last life raft floated away, the Boeing 737 slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the deep. For the passengers and crew of Flight 782, their nightmare had only just begun. The survivors of Flight 782 huddled together in the inflatable rafts, their faces pale and shaken from the crash. The vast Indian Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. No land, no boats, no sign of help. The wreckage of the 737 had already disappeared beneath the waves, leaving them completely isolated. Captain Monroe took charge, ensuring that each raft was accounted for. A quick head count confirmed everyone had made it out alive. But for how long? They had limited supplies, a few emergency flares, and a distress beacon that had been activated moments before the aircraft went under. The realization set in. They were lost at sea. As night approached, the temperature dropped drastically. The survivors clung to each other, some crying softly, others trying to keep warm. The ocean, once a distant and beautiful thing from above, now felt like a never-ending abyss beneath them. They had no way of knowing if help was coming, or if anyone had even heard their distress signal. And then, just as the darkness fully consumed the horizon, a distant, eerie glow appeared on the water's surface. Something was out there. The survivors' nerves were already frayed, but the sudden glow beneath the water sent a wave of panic through the group. The ocean was silent, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against their rafts. But something was moving. Something large. Did anyone see that? A passenger whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Captain Monroe turned sharply, scanning the surface. A deep, pulsating glow flickered just below the water, moving closer to the rafts. The survivors froze in place. It's probably bioluminescence. First Officer Hale tried to reassure the group, but his voice lacked confidence. This was something else. The glow grew brighter, then suddenly vanished. The ocean was pitch black again. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since the crash, Monroe felt real fear. Something was out there, and it knew they were here. Dawn broke, casting a golden glow over the ocean. But the survivors found little comfort in the daylight. The rafts drifted aimlessly, carried by unseen currents. Their water rations were running low and the heat was relentless. A young woman, Lisa, clutched her necklace, whispering a prayer. "We can't just wait here. Someone has to do something." Monroe agreed. "We need to signal for help. We need to stay visible." Using what little energy they had, the survivors tied the rafts together, forming a larger floating mass in hopes of increasing their visibility. Hale climbed onto the edge of the raft and set off a flare, the bright red signal, shooting into the sky. The survivors watched, hopeful, but after minutes passed, nothing happened. No response, no rescue aircraft, no ships on the horizon. Then, the water shifted. A large wave rolled underneath the rafts, stronger than before. The ocean was changing, and so was their situation. Hours after the flare was fired, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The once calm sea turned violent, the waves growing with each passing moment. "We need to hold on," Monroe shouted as strong winds battered the rafts. The survivors clung to each other, trying to keep the fragile floats together. Waves crashed over them, soaking them completely. Then, the worst happened. A monstrous wave struck. The rafts split apart, scattering the survivors into the raging sea. People screamed, trying to grab onto whatever they could. Monroe and Hale struggled to reach the others, but the force of the water was too strong. The group was separated. Lightning flashed above as the storm intensified. Monroe caught sight of a massive shadow beneath the waves, but before he could process it, another huge wave crashed over him, sending him spiraling into darkness. When Monroe regained consciousness, the ocean was silent again. The storm had passed, but now he was alone. The raft he had been on was gone, the others nowhere in sight. The sky had cleared, the sun now blazing overhead. But there was no land, no rescue. No sign of the other survivors. He turned his head and froze. Floating in the water, half submerged, was a metallic structure. Something unnatural, something that hadn't been there before. A low humming noise filled the air. The water around him began to ripple. Then, just before the screen fades to black, a blinding light engulfed everything. Flight 782 had disappeared.